Exodus 24. After giving the 10 Commandments and sharing some details of how they would work out in practice, God confirms his covenant with the people of Israel. The stakes are high. Hemant points this out.
What if Moses says no? Then the entire book of Exodus so far would be so useless.
But Israel doesn't say no. They're eager to grow into the radically caring community that God has depicted over the last few chapters. Now, we might be wondering what a covenant is. It's essentially a binding agreement between two parties to obey the terms that have been set in order to receive something in return. It's a bit like a contract, but with a covenant there's a much deeper commitment and relationship between the two parties than we would find in quite a lot of modern civil law. The question that the whole chapter seeks to answer then is, what does this deep commitment look like between God and his people? Well, the first thing we see in the narrative is God's call to worship and Moses recounting the law.
I feel like we've done this before, like several books ago.
It does feel a bit repetitive, but it's not bad editing. It's ceremonial. There's something very sacred going on as Israel reassent to this covenant. In a day-to-day way, it's a bit like a phone contract. When you go into the shop and you ask for a contract, you've effectively already agreed to the terms. But once you've read the contract for yourself, you've got another opportunity whether or not to agree to it. In another way, it's a bit like a wedding. The couple, early on in the service, they say, I will, when the vicar or the civil servant says, do you take this man or woman? And then a little bit later in the service, they recite the vows. They say, I give you this ring as a symbol. Here, although Israel agreed to become God's holy nation back in chapter 19, Moses recounts the words and the laws of the Lord, the contractual terms that have been given. And upon hearing of the picture of covenantal community, Israel agreed to keep them. Verse 3. The following day, one of the last things they do is to reread the book of the covenant. That's chapters 21 to 23. And the people, they reaffirm, we will obey. They formalized their intent to live by the terms of God's law. They were saved people, but now forevermore they will be covenant people. And part of the sacred ceremony is to recognize the permanence of the relationship established in this covenant with God, as Moses builds the altar and the stone pillars. Just as they will stand undisturbed, so will the covenant stand forever. Then we see something we're quite unused to, animal sacrifice.
A bunch of brainless sheep murdered some sheep, and then Moses threw some of their blood at the makeshift rock temple he made, and we're supposed to think all of this is just normal.
Now, I think Hemant's being very unfair to say that Israel are brainless. There are very good reasons why the laws that we've received are good to follow, and if you'd like to look at that, have a look at my videos covering them. But I admit that verses 5 through 8 obviously feel very strange, very alien. But there's something deeply significant in this ancient ritual. Someone writes that history is a foreign country. They do things different there. And as we look 3,500 years ago, it's not enough just to say this is absurd. We have to explore what was going on, what was meant by these patterns. Animal sacrifice was quite a common thing at that time. And so the question to be asked is not, why is this so weird compared to 21st century life? But how does this compare to what was going on at the time? Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings are the two types of sacrifice described in this section. Burnt offerings are explained in Leviticus 1. You burn up the whole animal as an atonement for the people. By the death of another, the people literally become at one with God. That's where we get the word atone, at one with God. The people's sin is punished in the death of the animal, and although strange to us, the sprinkling with blood represented the people's life renewed.
Why didn't Moses just give them meat as a sacrifice? We just saw that he slaughtered young bulls. Why sprinkle blood when you can just give them food? Everyone would be way happier.
That's where the fellowship offering comes in. They're also explained in Leviticus in chapter 3. What you do is you take the best cuts of the animal, the fat, and you burn them up. All the rest of the animal is cooked and eaten by the congregation, or the person that's come to bring the offering. This symbolises, as the name suggests, the fellowship between the person giving the sacrifice and God. In this context, the whole people of Israel are essentially eating a meal with God. God has received the best portion, the choice portion, as the guest of honour, and the people join in the joy of eating in relationship with God. So, to answer Hemon's question, the people had received food. Their sin had been dealt with the burnt offering, and they were now spiritually alive to enjoy relationship with God once more. The sprinkling of blood does feel really strange to us, but the symbolism of new life is just so crucial to the picture that's being presented to us. And I hope we recognise it's a radical claim to say that we are in fellowship with God. That sounds like a really weirdly religious phrase, but that God himself is counted as a friend. That is a staggering thing to say. But this chapter has one more staggering moment to offer us. God, beheld by the leaders of Israel, and a meal shared in his very presence.
So God is standing on Sapphire, and everyone sees this and says, "Cool, I'm hungry." No one says, "Oh my God, it's God."
Later in Exodus, God warns Moses that to behold him face to face would be lethal. And when God called Ezekiel and Isaiah as prophets, and they beheld him, they couldn't help but collapse on the floor. The same with Daniel as he saw him towards the end of his life, as a prophecy of the future was brought to him. When Peter, James and John saw Jesus transfigured on top of the mountain, they fell down on their face. The Apostle John also finds himself in the overwhelming presence of God at the beginning of Revelation, and he falls to the floor. To be before the presence of God, the Bible says, is overwhelming, is potentially lethal. But when Moses and the elders went up the mountain, God welcomed them into his presence. That's what it means when God doesn't raise his hand against them. Rather, the fellowship meal that was just enjoyed with the people of Israel is repeated at an infinitely more intimate level. God is with the men, and they sit and they eat together. This is an awesome claim. The God of the universe eating a meal with the leaders of his people. And not just that, but the end of the chapter speaks of Moses ascending higher up the mountain to approach even closer. In the same way that a satellite or spaceship might burn up as it approaches the sun, we read verses 15 and 16 and should expect Moses to disintegrate in the intensity of the radiance of God's holiness, appearing to the Israelites like a consuming fire. But instead, Moses dwells with God 40 days, 40 nights.
The Bible here is just mocking us, though. God was really high up, like in the clouds. And then Moses entered the cloud. And then he disappeared for how many days was Noah gone? 40 days.
This is indeed an interesting comparison. God's prophet to the world under judgment, Noah, undergoes a 40-day and night trial. Moses, God's prophet to Israel, also spends 40 days and nights with God. And 1,500 years later, the great prophet, Jesus, spends 40 days and nights in the wilderness, defying Satan's temptation. Either the Bible has a very meticulous group of human editors spanning 3,000 years of history, or the whole of salvation history has been orchestrated by the creator of all things. The latter seems more likely. As we look at it, every part of this covenantal picture points towards Jesus, the final satisfaction. We read of Jesus' face shining like the sun as the radiance of his glory is seen by some of his disciples in Matthew 17, Luke 9. And what about the animal sacrifice? Repeated endlessly year after year, could never make perfect those who draw near for worship. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all, and would no longer have felt the guilt for their sins. But the sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins, says the writer of Hebrews. But rather, the sacrifices, the blood, they all point towards the need for an ultimate sacrifice. The sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ, once for all, to make perfect forever those who are being made holy. In another way, his people are to one day be united with him as a bride to a groom. The Apostle John describes seeing the people of God, the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. Revelation 21, verse 2. And finally, God's eternal kingdom will usher in the permanent relationship between himself and his people. We see that in Revelation 21, 3-4. A loud voice from the throne of heaven was heard saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with humanity, and he will live with them. They'll be his people, and he will be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away." We stand metaphorically at the foot of the mountain of Exodus 24. And we're invited to behold the true glory of the God who has made a way for his enemies to become friends, convicts to become free citizens in his kingdom, for the unloved to become truly loved. I hope you found something here helpful or interesting. If you did, please leave a like to let me know. If you've got any questions, do drop me a message or put a comment in. I'd love to continue to explore these things with you. Do subscribe to be kept up to date with new releases. I look forward to exploring Exodus 25 next week.